the School of Fiction.
Hi, I'm James McCreet, and this is the School of Fiction.
James, so glad to have you. For fans of James or fans of Matt Stanley, as both are the same individual. And James, I'm going to call him James, is the very, very accomplished in terms of both traditional and self-publishing. And he is a writing coach, a former creative writing teacher, and a multi-genre author. So we have way, way too many things to talk about today, James. But you are originally from England,
Hmm.
correct? And now you live in Valencia, Spain, which
Hmm.
is one of the places in Spain I haven't been to. So what tell us, give us a little travel description of Valencia. Well, what made you pick that, and why should people come there?
I came here for work because my main vocation is a copywriter for businesses. And when I came here almost 10 years ago, it was supposed to be a good city for digital startups. And I thought it might be a good place to find work. In the end, most of the work I found is actually in different countries online, but it's still a good place to live. It's about 300 days of sun a year compared to about three in the north of England. So it's a much better climate.
Yeah, I know. I was actually spent one December around Christmas time in Spain, and I was like seeing fresh oranges on the trees in
Hmm.
December. So definitely, I love the climate in Spain. Absolutely, I'm with you on that. Well, James, I'm going to run through this list here, and then you have three novels with Macmillan under your name under the name James McCreet. With Routledge, you have one craft book about how to structure the novel, and then as
Hmm.
Matt Stanley, you have three novels and two travel books, and then five additional self-published books, including a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Uh,
Hmm.
so this is a lot, and it it does you credit. I'm very impressed. Let me see if I can pull up some of these things for us to look at. All right, so here are the James McCreet books. Uh, This is before you write your novel.
Hmm.
This is the craft book. And what is Macmillan New Writing?
That was a scheme which allowed authors to submit directly to Macmillan without an agent,
Oh,
um, because obviously, as one of the big five publishers, they generally don't accept any kind of unsolicited submissions. But
mhm.
they realized that maybe they were missing out because maybe agents were filtering out manuscripts that they might want to see. And so for a period of 1 or 2 years, maybe they took manuscripts directly from authors, and that's how I got published with Macmillan.
I see. Good. I'm not, although I have yet to interview a literary agent. I might change my mind, but I'm not a literary agent fan, to be honest. So these have a kind of a Victorian feel to them. Many of them do. You want to tell us about
Yeah, it's Victorian detective fiction in the sense that um, the detective squad of the London Metropolitan Police started in 1844, and that's round about the time that the word detective appeared as a person who investigates crimes. So I wanted to start right at the beginning. This is about 40 years before Sherlock Holmes. And it kind of came out, my series came out of a master's thesis I wrote on the development of detective fiction, starting with Edgar Allan Poe, um, and particularly one story by Poe, which was The Man of the Crowd. And one of the ideas in that very short story is this concept that you can blend with a crowd, you can change your appearance very slightly and become a different person. And so, in a time before fingerprints, before photography, before any kind of scientific way to identify a person, you could grow a beard or change your jacket and basically disappear in the city. And so I had a character who was a kind of investigator who realized that and who was basically anonymous in the city, could adopt various different personas.
Yeah. And is that Albert
Um,
Newsom?
no, no, he was one of the detectives of the Metropolitan Police, along
Oh, so he's
with
trying to catch the other character.
Yeah, well, actually, it's a kind of an ensemble piece because each novel, the investigation is split between two rival detectives. One of them is kind of disgraced and loses his job after the first book, and then there's the guy who is able to blend in with the crowd. That's Noah Webster. I think it's Noah Webster. I've not read the books for a very long time.
Hmm.
Noah Dyson. That's right. Is it Noah? I can't even remember the name of the
Hmm.
character. Um, so yeah, what happens is all three characters investigate the crimes from different directions, and their narratives interweave, and at some point they all meet and either agree to work with each other or fight against each other.
Well, this is wonderful. I really like the idea of Victorian detective investigation, and before Holmes also. Really cool. Let's talk before you write your novel. Oh, by the
So
way,
that's a book.
you're starting in the 2010s, 2011s. I started as a 100% self-published in 2011
Hmm.
myself.
Right.
So we got this part of our career started around the same time. So
Hmm.
before you write your novel,
That grew out of I taught a master's in creative writing, specifically a novel course, for 3 years at a British university. Um, And as part of that course, I think it was one of only two courses in the UK that required students to write and be assessed on an entire finished novel. That's no longer the case now, but at the time they had to write, I think it was at least 80,000 words. And
in what
so
time frame?
it depends. I think full-time students had a year, I think it was, and part-time students had 3 years, which could be extended to 5 years.
Wow,
Um,
that is very different, and
yeah,
definitely here in the United States, we just lost the official organization behind what's called National Novel Writing Month, in which people try to write an entire novel in November.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that
Yeah,
scheme. I have my
yeah,
doubts about it. Maybe there are some benefits, but
yeah.
I'm highly dubious in general about that.
The organization went under, and people really liked it, and they started to create alternate versions of it
Hmm.
that were not connected to the nonprofit that went under. So
Right,
yeah, for me, I can't do it because I'm immensely busy with job.
right.
So I just try to write as best that I can. Let's take a look at the books under Matt Stanley, and where I want to talk about the Poe book, but where should we start?
I mean, they're all extremely different. Some
Yeah.
of them are historical, there's adventure, there's satire, there's straightforward contemporary fiction, there's surrealist fiction, there's urban fantasy. They're all
Mhm.
completely different. You can start with whichever one interests you the most, I guess.
Well, okay. Well, I'm gonna go to the Poe book then.
Right.
Okay. So this is a biography, and what makes it stand out from other Poe books? I mean, I like these questions.
Well, I guess that the first thing to say is it's not really a biography. I mean, in its entirety, if you read the whole book, it turns out to be a biography. But what it really is a psychological study that grew out of an essay. Poe disappeared for 3 months when he was 18 in, I want to say 1827. And to this day, nobody knows where he was. There are some theories, but there's no proof. Um, and some people said he went to Greece to fight in the War of Independence. Some people say he was hiding out and slowly starving in Boston. Um, and although at the end of the book I offer my opinion on where he actually was during that time, the interesting aspect is that for his whole life, he led people to believe that he'd gone to Greece to fight in the War of Independence. And when he died, most of the biographies said that was true. Um, Although the only person who said that it wasn't true was him in a biographical sketch that he prepared to appear in an anthology of poetry. But the way he phrased his denial of going to Greece um, was very odd because in that same biography, almost everything else he said was a lie.
Well,
Um, and
so
so the
I'm asking
question
you a
is,
couple of questions about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
What
what
do you
happens is,
think is the explanation for his often described as mysterious death?
I didn't look too closely into that because whole books have been written about it and novels as well. And so I don't really have enough evidence. What I did in this book is I reported the facts as we know them, that he was found in another man's suit wearing a strange hat and calling out another man's name without context. Um, it's highly likely he was drunk and also going through delirium tremens. He was having hallucinations a lot towards the end of his life because the amount of the damage that the drink had done. He was also taking opium to calm himself, um, but the opium was morphine mixed with alcohol. I'm not sure he realized it was mixed with alcohol, so it was just making him drunker and giving him hallucinations. So although it's not clear what happened to him, certainly the context is probably the drug abuse and the alcohol abuse.
So
Um,
the other thing that always troubles me, with writers I really admire, like Poe, is something to do with their choices of partner. His choices of partner tended to be extremely young. Do you think that's a pathology of some sort, or do you think it was more suitable to the time, or what do you make of the fact that he fell in love with people much young, with really young women?
I'm not sure it's fair to say that that's true. He only did it once with his cousin.
Oh.
She was 13 or possibly 12, according to some reports, when they got married. But before that, he'd had at least two girlfriends of his own age. And after his wife died, he had girlfriends of his own age. In fact, the last girlfriend he had was also the first girlfriend he had. He came back to her after 30 years. So the only anomaly was his cousin.
So
Uh,
you're inclined to say then that this was just like some kind of a connection of souls where age wasn't really the factor.
yeah, I mean, I don't think it was a sexual relationship at all. I think it was more of a brother and sister thing. He used to call her his sister, and he used to address her as his sister in letters. I think it was a kind of protective urge. It was a romantic, quixotic gesture, as he said himself. He
Hmm.
wanted to save her. And also, because he'd been abandoned by his adoptive family, this was the only family left to him. And he had this very romantic ideal of the family unit. And so by marrying his cousin and living with his aunt, who he renamed his mother,
Hmm.
he was kind of creating this fantasy of a family unit.
Well, you've
Um,
cleared up a lot of things for me because I had a very different notion of him than what you're describing, and this helps a lot for me to understand. It'll make it easier for me to teach Poe in the future
mhm.
if I can mention some of these things. And I need to get this book for sure. Uh, so let's pick out one more, and then we'll move on to talk about a couple of other topics. Let's talk about Street Labyrinth.
Okay, so this one is, well, I've never read any fantasy books, but some readers have told me this is an urban fantasy.
Mhm.
What interested me, this was a thematic book. Sometimes I start with a character, sometimes I start with a story, sometimes I start with a theme, and this one was a theme, and it was about monsters, why it was necessary throughout all of human mythology and storytelling for monsters to exist. And I did quite a lot of research into understanding that necessity for there to be monsters. Um, and then I came up with this idea of a strange guy, kind of sociopathic guy, very rich, who has a zoo. He calls it a territorium, but it's a zoo of folkloric and mythological creatures. So he has a gorgon, a centaur, a dragon. He has the Jabberwock from Lewis Carroll. The problem is that the public aren't interested because you see these things once in a cage or in its enclosure, and simply seeing it in a safe environment takes away all the mystery. So people don't come anymore. They just lose all interest. And the guy who has this place, he's obsessed with the importance and the necessity of monsters. They're supposed to create fear and awe and wonder. And so he releases them into the city. He keeps them in one particular place, but he allows them to go out every now and then. So the Medusa, the Gorgon, is on a dating app, and we follow her dating history. There's a biblical giant who becomes a local politician. The satyr is out in the gay disco, and all sorts of chaos erupts.
Biblical
And
giant, you mean like Nephilim?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And so
I
the
think I would really like this book too. I made the right selection. Going off of the cover, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a book that I would definitely read, with potential for it to be a film as well. So
I hope so.
I like that tremendously. James, you have published a lot of articles here. Right,
Yeah.
this is UK Writers Magazine, so it's writers-online.co.uk. So tell us about the sort of things that you wrote here.
Okay, there's basically two kinds of articles I write. I do a monthly column called Under the Microscope, which started around 2010. And what happens is readers send in the first 300 words of their novel, and I do a forensic analysis of the prose, word by word, line by line. I usually make about 30 or 35 comments on the 300 words. Um, and that's analysis at every level. So as a holistic thing, if it works as a piece, as a scene, punctuation, sentence structure, vocabulary choice, narrative perspective, and the level of detail and the focus depends on the piece of writing it is. Um, but it's quite popular because what happens is they print the original extract, and you can see where my footnotes have been added, and then readers have the opportunity to see where the footnotes are and maybe guess what it is I'm going to say, and then they check the copy, and that explains why I've highlighted that part and how I think it might be changed for the better.
Yeah. Can I pull that
And
up
then,
under writing advice?
yeah,
Or
I'm not sure there's any actually examples of that on the website. Although what I do is I also edit
here
and
we go.
rewrite the 300 words. So I rewrite them using my own advice as a guide to the original author, how it might be done differently.
So I
I've
see
been
it's
doing
how to write /credited.
That's
That
right. So
should
the
help people to
accredited
find
version
it.
is my version.
Yeah.
And I also do articles on generic craft. So, I might do a piece, for example, on which tense to choose or how to structure a novel. Recently, I did a series on how fiction and non-fiction influence each other, and how creative non-fiction works. But so there's normally a couple of my articles in each magazine for the last few years.
This is wonderful, and I think that's an excellent resource. Since I want to go and read a whole bunch of those. This is I think transitions us pretty well to the question about that we were going to discuss together, which is for apprentice writers, such as the ones who are submitting the material here for you to critique. How does an apprentice writer get good feedback? So I'm gonna get out of the screen share here
Mhm.
so that okay, here we go. And I'm just going to invite you to talk about this. There are a lot of ways that it's done, and I'm currently in a lot of Facebook groups, which I met you, I think, in one of those,
Mhm.
where people are having a variety of different types of communications. Some of them were wonderful, and some of them toxic.
Mhm.
So I know that the search for feedback that takes place there is very hit and miss,
Yeah.
but you're able to give a feel for all of the venues that are available and make a recommendation. So let's turn it over to you, James, and talk about that.
Okay. So there are various places that writers can seek feedback. I can't possibly go through all of them, but I've got a list here, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of each one, which obviously depend on what level you are as a writer and what you're looking for. So writing groups in general, whether that's an online writing group or a kind of sit down table thing where you discuss a piece of work. I was in writing groups from when I was 17, and at various parts in my life, I've been a member of such a group and also a leader of such a group. And they do have some pros and cons. If the people in that group are the same level as you, or ideally better, then you can get some very good feedback, because if there are 10 people in that group and they all go around and they tell you how you might improve your work, if you listen to those people, and especially if they're repeating the same things, then within just a few weeks, you can basically eradicate all of the major flaws in your work. Of course, that depends on the people in that group being a higher level than you. If they're not, then you're not going to get that advice that you need, and you'll just stay at the same level. And if you do take on that advice and incorporate it into your work, then very quickly there won't be there won't be very much anybody can tell you. They'll just say, yeah, that's great. Or they might pick on one comma or something like that. And at that stage, the group has become redundant for you as a writer because you've outgrown it. You have to look for a group with a higher standard of writer. But again, very quickly, if you take on their advice and incorporate it, you'll outgrow that group as well. And as you said, a lot of groups can be quite toxic, especially if it's an online group and there's thousands of people in the group. Um, they kind of create their own weird subcultures or microclimates, where one person thinks that their advice is better than everybody else's, or people insist that you write like them. Um,
That's
it
what
can
I
become
ran
quite
into
problematic.
in creative writing school here in the US too. Mm.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think that's a writing group is generally something to engage with quite early in your writing career. Um, but if you're an attentive writer who studies hard, I think you'll outgrow that very quickly. Books and guides. There are various books on how to write novels. I've written one myself. How to structure novels. And there are some useful pieces of information in these, but they do tend to be quite prescriptive. Some of them offer a particular system or a formula on how to write a book. But
David
the
Cat
problem,
writes a novel.
that's right, yeah. But all writers are different. That's the problem. Everyone has their own process in the end, um, and their own pace. And so a book is always going to be a generic guide, which might not suit you or might suit you. And also, you can't ask questions. I mean, let's say it's a guide on how to structure a novel. You can try and follow that as best you can. But if you fall down along the way, it's not like you can contact the author and ask them how to do it. Um, so it's kind of a one-way communication process. And a lot of people misunderstand as well. I mean, I know that Stephen King's On Writing is extremely popular among writers, but a lot of writers come away from that book thinking that you should never, ever use an adverb. And that's clearly ridiculous. You can see that King
Well,
himself uses adverbs.
that's
Uh,
driving me crazy too.
yeah,
There's two that I really want to fight against, and that's one, and the other one is show don't tell, which
yeah,
we're going to talk
yeah,
about in another session that I'm recording today.
yeah,
That
yeah,
they are just not nuanced enough. So
yeah,
yeah, I get tired of people saying them without understanding the nuances. Like
yeah. That's
it's
that's the
often good
danger.
advice, but not every
Yeah,
single time.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
And people who read those books tend to take them as some sort of canonical law, and what they want to do is come away with a list of rules. I had a student on the master's course who insisted that she'd read a book saying that you should never use dialogue, and she was writing a thriller. So, I mean, they just don't think about these things. If it's in a book, it must be true, but that's clearly not the case. You have to bring your own sense of logic to it. Um, there was a crime. I used to be part of the British Crime Writers Association when I was writing crime books, and it had its own magazine. And I remember one guy wrote an article. He'd written like 3 or 4 crime books, quite well reviewed, but not very well sold. And then he wrote a book which I think was called How Not to Write a Novel. And that book sold more than all of his crime books put together. And he was so disillusioned that he stopped writing because he said that, people clearly didn't want to buy his books, they just wanted to write their own. Um, that's just a kind of side anecdote. But the book I wrote, which I won't claim is a kind of silver bullet for all writers' problems, did grow out of 3 years teaching creative writing students, and is based on the problems I saw they were having, which were almost entirely structural, because you can teach someone craft in a matter of weeks if they're attentive. But the huge problem for most debut novelists is structure. Um, they'll write well, but very, very seldom will the book hold together. And so my book is about how to understand structure.
Mhm.
So onto courses. There are a lot of people offering courses as well, especially now, online courses, the masterclass things, for example, or it might be a course that you actually attend, like a master's degree or an MFA, I think they're called in America.
Yes, I have one of
Uh,
those. Yeah.
right, I have one also from very long ago. It was absolutely useless, but that's a different story. But again, these courses tend to be generic. They're set up to teach all writers. Um, and so, although theoretically all writers on those courses are roughly the same level, it's never the case. Some are better, some are worse. And of course, any kind of teaching has to address a generalized level. And so, if you're an outstanding writer, you'll find the course too slow, and if you're at the other end of the spectrum, you might find it too demanding. So it's never quite a perfect fit. Also, a lot of those courses in the UK tend to be quite literature focused. Rather than teaching you how to write, they'll teach you how to read because the people teaching them, not always, are actually published writers. And so on my course, it was me and a few other lecturers, and they would give the students a reading list of maybe 10 books, one to read each week, and then they would discuss the books during the course. But for me, that's a literature course. I was much more interested in looking at the students' work and how to improve it. So you never know what you're going to get in terms of teachers. Another issue is that if the person teaching that course is someone who doesn't plot, they're just a pantster or someone who writes by the seat of their pants, they won't be able to help you plot your book because they don't know how to plot a book. I had a student come to me and he asked me, look, I've got this teacher, and I asked her, um, how do I where does the story come from? How does the structure work? And his teacher told him, oh, just write and it'll come. But that's exceptionally bad advice.
Oh, a pantser.
Yeah. Um, but the point is that there are certain things you can learn about structure, however you approach it. If you plan or if you pants it, if you don't understand how structure works, in the end, you're not going to write a publishable book. So structure has to be taught. And then you can either apply that after you've written a draft, or you can plan it before you write the draft.
No. I had a
Um,
professor, I think you'll like this story. He was teaching fiction writing workshops and he had no published fiction.
yeah,
He had
yeah,
published one book, which was about how to write fiction, but he had never
yeah,
published any fiction, not even a short story. And yet he was the head of the creative writing department. And needless to say, he and I did not get along.
yeah. That was the case with my course, which is why I
Yeah.
said it was useless. So yeah, you definitely need a published writer, and you need a writer who understands how you write, so they can help you with your own process, because there's no single process. And so they're not going to help you at all if they write in a different way to you. But of course, if they have a class of 10 people, maybe they don't have time to focus entirely on you. There's probably part of the course, they might have a dedicated hour each week or whatever to speak only with you. And that's really good. I mean, that's one thing you get from a course that is difficult to find. It's contact with an actual professional author, assuming there is one on the course. Another huge issue, the biggest issue, is that most courses don't ask you to write an entire novel. And that's because teachers just simply haven't got time to read 10 whole novels at the end of a semester and grade them. It's work they don't want to do, and it's usually work they're not paid for. And so most assessments are on 15 or 20,000 words, something like that. And that's pretty much useless because most debut novels fail on structure. And if someone isn't assessing the whole structure, then that course hasn't helped you. I think in the UK, there's at least one course that requires a full novel. That was at Bath Spa University. I don't know if that's still the case, or maybe there are other courses which are offering a full novel, but it's not popular amongst the lecturers. Also because a lot of debut novels are really quite terrible, and they're very frustrating to read for a teacher.
Yeah, well, I
So,
was taught on short fiction only.
right.
You could put
Okay.
up a novel chapter if you wanted to
Yeah.
in the workshop system, but people generally didn't talk about novel writing at all. I didn't
Right.
have anything about novel structure. I mean, I actually went into graduate school already having been an apprentice writer on my own for a long time,
Hmm.
but so it wasn't an issue for me so much. But everything was only on short fiction. So
Okay.
I said we were going to talk about the difference between U.S. and U.K.
Yeah.
And so this is very interesting. Some of the things that you're saying about the UK system, which seems to have a different set of flaws than the US system.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Well,
No,
on
no
my
one
course,
taught novel structuring in the '90s when I was in school. I don't know what's going on now either.
yeah. Well, again, it's a minefield teaching novel structure because there are various different formulaic approaches to writing a novel, and what I tried to teach was the most generic possible understanding of how to structure a novel. Um, and a lot of students are very resistant to that, especially literary writers, because they insist that literature, isn't about structure. And I would point them to, pieces of high literature, Moby Dick, for example, which has a very clear structure, very clear narrative drive, even if it digresses a lot. Um, and the whole point of structure is that the reader shouldn't notice how a book is structured, but they should notice if it isn't. Um, it's difficult to teach and it's difficult to learn. Another form of feedback, which I've seen quite recently since I've been on Facebook, is that a lot of writers now they write a manuscript and then they send it off to an editor. They pay for an editor, and what they're hoping is that the editor will fix the book and will send it back to them ready to be published. The problem is that editing isn't for that. An edit is a polish. The assumption is that the book is already 99% ready. That's how traditional publishers handle it. And so the editor is there just to find the odd mistake, or if something is confusing, if there's an inconsistency. But generally speaking, the book is 99% ready. But what happens now is that people who simply can't write at all will send their book to an editor, and the editor won't be able to fix that book. They might be able to, pull out all of the grammatical and spelling mistakes and give it back to you, but it's still unpublishable because the dialogue doesn't work and the description is excessive and the overall structure doesn't work. And so the problem there is that you're assessing the manuscript after the fact. The author has spent 1 year, 5 years working on a manuscript and repeating the same mistake page after page, chapter after chapter, and then hands it to an editor. And then the editor has to go through and find all of those errors, which repeat all the way through.
The
I've
limited
seen,
amount of editing, coaching sort of stuff that I've done,
yeah,
I can see that precisely. One person I was working with, wonderful human being. I said to him, you know, if I'm spending an hour and a half on one page explaining to you about this, then there's just no realistic way that I can get this whole manuscript up to speed. It has to be rewritten completely.
yeah,
I know exactly
exactly that.
the
Yeah.
precise thing, and it's not, I think, what that wonderful individual wanted to hear,
Hmm.
but I didn't know what else to say.
Yeah.
It's a problem. So, but
Yeah.
you have a recommendation. So tell us about that.
Well, I mean, I used to do quite a lot of editing, but that was exactly the problem I found that after looking at just the first chapter or even the first page, I would say you don't need an editor. First of all, you need to learn to write. That's the essential part of writing a novel. And so that's when I moved more into coaching, um, because coaching is entirely bespoke. You're not treating the manuscript, you're treating the writer. Um, and so rather than looking at the whole novel, what I generally do is I say to the author, okay, give me the first chapter and let's look at everything wrong with the first chapter, because whatever's wrong with the first chapter is wrong with the rest of the book. So we can assess dialogue, description, pace, narrative perspective, scene building, paragraphing, just the basic mechanisms of prose. And I go through that with them. And then the knowledge they get from that, they can edit the rest of the whole book for that. In terms of story, no. But in terms of prose, they now have the tools to reread their own book better, even to the point where they can send it to an editor. I mean, it's a reasonably slow process. What I ask people to do is pay for 8 hours in advance. And those 8 hours might last 2 or 3 months because they send me a chapter and I might spend 40 minutes on a chapter or 2 hours. Then they rewrite it and send it me back and I spend 20 minutes on it. And so we go on like that. So their 8 hours might last a few months. Some people ask me to read the entire novel and give them feedback on the structure, which I've done before. And in some cases, I will tell them how to restructure it and what could be cut. But I will also say, look, these are the problems with the prose. And it doesn't matter how good the overall structure is. If an agent or a publisher sees that first page, they're not going to read more than 2 paragraphs. So rather than look at the whole story, let's look at the prose.
You
But if
use the
people
word
want,
bespoke, and I
yeah,
want to clarify that for the audience. Bespoke, basically organized around the individual needs. We see that in what's called a bespoke tailor, who will
hmm
take all your measurements. So this is bespoke coaching, in other words, as opposed to the workshop structure or a class structure. This is a one-on-one where your response is not generic, but it is focused on a particular individual's needs. So it's a wonderful word for it. I haven't heard it applied before to this type of thing, but it seems very accurate, and it seems like this kind of apprenticeship kind of system you're describing, I think might well be the best way to do it.
yeah, I mean, it requires a lot of work on the writer's part because for every 20 or 40 minutes that I do, the writer might have to do weeks of work, but that's how it should be. That's the writing process. Um, and it's the importance of the bespoke approach is that I'm not applying any kind of system. What happens is my feedback is based on what the book is. So if it's a fantasy book or a crime book or a piece of literature, or if it's a comedy, um, then that's how I assess the book. How can I make that funnier? How can I make a thriller more tense? How can I make a comedy funnier? Um, and so it all starts from what is the book? What does the book want to be? Let's make that happen. Um, and that's not something you would get with all those other methods I talked about, with the course, with the books, with editing. Um, I mean, I'm working with someone at the moment now who's writing a kind of it's a dark comedy, I would say. And this person has a very interesting and distinctive sense of humor, but but they need some help writing the jokes. I can see what it is they want to say that's funny, but there's a way to structure a joke to make it funnier. Sometimes you have to say less. Sometimes you have to put the punchline in the final word. And so it's a case of how can we emphasize your very distinctive humor? Um, and again, that's not necessarily something an editor would provide. They would simply look at what's wrong and what's right, rather than how it can be better according to its own parameters. I should say as well, as a final thing, that the value of any kind of feedback depends on how the writer handles it. Um, you have to recognize what good or bad feedback is, and you have to trust the person giving it to you. And something I find a lot when I was teaching at the university, and when I'm talking with people online, is that people are naturally very close to their work and believe in it strongly. And some people refuse to hear any kind of negative comments at all. I was talking to someone the other day online. They posted an extract from their novel and they asked for feedback. And my feedback was that um, what they needed to do was to go right back to the roots of their writing and their craft because it was flawed on every level. Um, and they came back to me and said that that was just my opinion, that every writer is different and every writer has their own nuance. Um, and I had to say, well, that's simply not the case because, not using paragraphs correctly is not a nuance. If you begin every sentence in a paragraph with a subordinate clause, that's not a matter of opinion. If you're using vocabulary with the wrong meaning, that's not a matter of opinion. If sentence length is all the same, if it's very uniform and creates a kind of dead tone, that's not a matter of opinion. But if someone isn't willing to trust in the person giving feedback, then they're not going to improve. Which raises another question. How do you know you can trust the person? What does good feedback look like? And I would suggest that good feedback is always detailed and highly specific, and it explains. So, for example, I mentioned subordinate clauses. People begin a sentence with, as he entered the room, comma, he did this. Thinking quickly, comma, and every sentence begins like this. If you do that in a whole paragraph, all the sentence becomes convoluted and the paragraph becomes much slower and it sounds more like an academic treatise. Whereas if you mix active, not active, if you mix dominant clauses and subordinate
Sentence
clauses,
types. Yeah.
yeah, it creates a whole different feel. And
Sentence
this is
variety.
something a
Yeah.
lot of writers do this simply without noticing. But once someone tells you what a subordinate clause is and how it's used and how it isn't used and what effect it has on the reader, then you suddenly see it and then you start using it correctly. That's good feedback. But if someone tells you your sentences are convoluted, what does that even mean? And that doesn't help you at all.
Exactly.
Um,
Well, grammar teaching is at a very low level in the United States. I don't know how it is in Britain, but in the U.S., when I try to explain grammar, my students' eyes kind of cross. So I'm not teaching adults though. I'm teaching high school, but
right,
like say 14 to 18, those ages.
right, yeah.
Right.
I
So
think
I want to ask you one more
yeah,
question related to this. And then after that, I'll say thank you, and then we'll have a little chat after I stop the recording.
yeah.
So the James, the one final question I wanted to ask you about coaching is how is it different for, say, real beginners, especially very young people? Because what you're describing is really coaching for adults who've been working on it for a while.
Mhm.
So if we had someone who's like, well, I want to be a writer, but I really don't know how to do it, what is their approach? What is their method into the craft?
I mean, that's difficult. It depends on the age. Recently, I was looking at some work by a girl, a Spanish girl who was 11 or 12 at the time, but writing in English. Um, and her work was truly excellent. It was probably as good as probably an 18-year-old English person. Better, in fact, because grammatically it was more accurate. Um, really a very good writer using techniques with it, which a lot of adults, amateur writers haven't mastered. But because she's so very young, the idea of analyzing her work doesn't really work. And so with someone that young, who's already very good, my advice to her parents was to just let her keep on writing because she loves it and she's enjoying it. Um, And at this point, I think to go into any great detail on the quite complex techniques required to make her work better would stop the joy for her. And I think it's important at that age just to have the joy. I mean, in this particular case, she doesn't need much help because her writing's already very good. Um, Generally speaking, I don't teach children. That was a favor for someone to look at her work. Um, I have worked with people who are writing in English as a second language, and with complete beginners as well. And with those, a lot of remedial work is necessary. So the first thing I tell them is go and get a book on the rules of punctuation and learn it. It's not difficult, and let's start there. And that takes a while to get the hang of that because people don't like the idea that they're writing according to rules. But once they understand the punctuation and they start to structure their sentences better, then we start looking at paragraphs and sentence forms. But the important thing for me with someone who needs that level of attention is I try to avoid at all costs the idea that we're talking about grammar, that it's technical. What it's really about is meaning. So what I'll do is I'll say, look, you wrote the sentence like this. How about we write it like that? Can you see the difference? And they look at the difference, and then we talk about that. I don't have to explain to them that it's a subordinate clause or that it's passive voice or whatever, because do they really need to know that terminology? All they need to know is if they write it like this, it has this effect, and if they write it like that, it has that effect. Um, and maybe at some stage, if they want to do some further reading or learning, then I'll tell them what kind of grammar it is. Um, but yeah, I think I find that people respond better to how it works, what it means, what the emphasis is, rather than what piece of language we're using.
Yeah. Well, I agree. James, we have certainly not exhausted the number of things that we could talk about. So I'm going to invite you to come back the next time we have a project that you want to talk about. And thank you so much for being here. I'll stop the recording and we'll talk a little bit.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
it's been a pleasure.
The School of Fiction.